Great. Well, great. Welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming to this book launch of the book published by Bloomsbury, The Philosophy of Rabbi Shalom Ber Schneersohn, Language, Gender, and Mysticism. And with us today is the author, Dr. Reuven Leigh. And so we'll just give you a sense, we'll start off by a bit of discussion between myself and Dr. Leigh, and to help get into some of the more interesting elements of the book. And then we'll also have time and open it up to questions at the end. So, and just to know, I think I checked with everyone beforehand. I think everybody has read the book entirely who's here, but there was one person who said that they haven't read it. So for the sake of that one person, maybe, Reuven, could you start by giving just a bit of a short description of what you think the key points of the book, what is the book about, and maybe what motivated you or led you to write this book?
All right, thank you. I think we can do first name terms.
Oh, yes, all right. I should introduce myself. For those, I'm Daniel Weiss. I'm the Polanski Coexist Senior Lecturer in Jewish Studies in the Faculty of Divinity. And I'm proud to count myself as someone who's both a friend of Reuven's, and I supervise the PhD, but also someone who has also been my teacher and I've learned from a lot. So I think all three of those things could be a good basis for conversation. So we'll go from there.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for coming. So first of all, although I write in the acknowledgements at the beginning, thank you to Daniel. It's worth repeating again and in person for all of his support in enabling me to do the research and to learn how to write about it in a coherent way. Daniel sent me a message this morning after having sort of looked over the book again last night and sort of amazed at saying how he thought it was quite a good read. And I think a lot of the credit goes to him for putting up with some of my earlier drafts and pointing out in a delicate and supportive way ways in which it could be improved. So I appreciate that very much. So the book. First of all, a caveat. Although the book is called The Philosophy of Rabbi Shalom Ber Schneersohn, and that was a recommendation of the publishers in order to make it just maybe a bit clearer. It is not a book about the philosophy of Rabbi Shalom Ber Schneersohn. It's a book about an aspect of the philosophy of Rabbi Shalom Ber Schneersohn. He was a very prolific writer and wrote about a whole range of topics. And I picked on one small segment of his thought, which I thought was quite important, quite foundational. But I don't claim to reflect the entirety of what he has to contribute. And I'd like to think there are many more books, not necessarily by me, but by other researchers, to really tease out some of the exciting ideas that he develops, which have, as of yet, not been touched hardly at all by people in the academy, and even in more sort of broader circles outside of Chabad adherents. So the book is about the way in which he discusses in a series of sermons he gave in 1898, the way in which historically we've conceived and perceived of a range of oppositional binaries as being fixed and set. And that comes with a whole range of assumptions. And he picks on ideas around language, around gender. He goes further into things about the body. And then more mystically, he talks about various different metaphysical structures, which have always orientated themselves around the idea that there's a primary, significant, what he describes as a provider, an initial stage, and that is then manifest in a more secondary and delimited way in a receiver, in a makabel. And the implications of this thinking is that, say, taking the example of consciousness and speech. So the idea that internally we're all capable of comprehending various different ideas, and that is where comprehension, intellectual integrity is really found internally. And then at times we want to communicate that with others, and the act of communication through speech is a way of we need to reduce, conceal, a whole range of things going on in our own head in order to share that message. So in the final version, the speech version of that idea is a much smaller, less significant reflection of the actual idea as it was in the mind. And he sees that as not being entirely reflective of the actual experience of speaking. So many people here may have been involved in lecturing and teaching in various forms, or just giving a speech in some way, that the act of speaking often is a transformative event. That when speaking, a person is able to conjure up ideas that in all of their research in preparation for their speech or in preparation for their lecture didn't come to their mind. But in the very act of speaking, all of a sudden, new ideas come to their head. And immediately after their talk, they might have to write things down and they're invigorated. And he said, if we follow the original model, it should be impossible for that to happen. Because if we maintain this sense of a hierarchy, whereby in this example, the intellectual thought is primary, and all that is received in speech as the makabel, as this recipient of ideas, is a limited version of what was originally in thought. How is it possible for them, through the act of speaking, to generate new ideas, deeper ideas, further ideas that weren't previously available? It should have that limitation of only being, at its very best, equal to the idea, but not superior to it. And by observing this phenomenon, he develops an idea whereby we have to reappraise what we think about the act of receiving, this position of the makabel in a whole range of circumstances, be it in speech, be it as another polarity he brings is male-female, another polarity he brings is soul-body. And by questioning all of these positions, he's not just doing an interesting intellectual exercise. There is a thorough undoing of the entire Western philosophical heritage that he's engaging with, and in some ways also large parts of Jewish thought too. So the book is about how he does this in the 1898 lectures, and that is, I would say, one aspect of the book. The second aspect of the book is to recognize, by him actually doing this, he's doing something very intellectually, philosophically important, relevant, interesting, such that these are the ideas that he's working with would only sort of achieve popularity in philosophical circles much later in the second half of the 20th century, mainly in postmodern philosophical thought, in continental philosophy. And what I wanted to show is how the ways in which his ideas could be brought into dialogue with a few of the thinkers of that period. And in doing so, ways in which his ideas could not just anticipate what they're saying, but how his ideas could possibly interpret, help us explain and understand some of the things they're saying. But in the nature of a dialogue, that those ideas could also help us understand him better. And this then opens up a broader discussion about how we think about, and we maybe sometimes pigeonhole traditional thinkers, and in this case, traditional rabbinic thinkers, and how their ideas are often overlooked, ignored, and not treated with any degree of interest in the fields of philosophy, in the fields of modern Jewish philosophy, in really any field of Jewish studies or philosophical studies. And for that, it sort of hopefully is a prompt for further research about other philosophically astute rabbis of the modern period and how they could become meaningful interlocutors with contemporary discussions about philosophical ideas.
No, thank you. And so, no, that's really, so maybe I'll read a paragraph building on what you just said from your book and ask you to see what you can expand on it, because so this is on page 55, where you write, prior to its popularization in 20th century philosophy, Schneersohn brought into question the privileging of certain elements in oppositional binary structures. The presumed primary importance of soul, of intellectual consciousness, and of men were challenged, allowing for the emergence of an alternative perception of the significance of the body, speech, and women. In this way, Schneersohn unexpectedly heralds some of the major concerns and developments of 20th century philosophy. And I wonder, you write this, and now if I understand what you said just now, you have these binaries where that both in the dominant traditions in Western philosophy and certain streams in Jewish thought, you had these binaries of, here we have that the intellectual consciousness has a certain priority and superiority over speech, and the soul has superiority over the body, and men have superiority over women. And you're saying, then you're arguing that Schneersohn is questioning those hierarchies and the way they're normally thought about. And so I wonder what's, in some ways that could sound surprising. Why would, to think that a late 19th century rabbi from a more traditionalist background who didn't go to university and isn't writing in typical modes of philosophy would be challenging those hierarchies. You would think someone from that background, they would be reinforcing those hierarchies. So I guess one question would be, and then we can say, but why should that be so surprising? And does that speak that if that would still be surprising today, are there still prejudices about, it seems like you're raising prejudices about what the idea that someone from this certain cultural context would not be relevant to modern philosophical questions? And where do you think that prejudice comes from? And why, if various types of prejudices in relation to groups being excluded from fields of philosophy or other realms of thought have been challenged, but do you think what's going on where this element would, this type of prejudice would still be retained?
So I would say the prejudice is embedded in a whole range of setups. And this doesn't affect just rabbinic thinkers. This has affected women philosophers. This has affected Black philosophers, Asian philosophers. So people who are sort of outside of this white Christian male setup of what philosophy is perceived to be. And I quote in the book George Yancey, who I think expresses it extremely forcefully, how there is such a thing called philosophy, which assumes its own neutrality and its situatedness as being universal. And every other form of philosophy has to have a descriptor. So you'll have feminist philosophy, you'll have Asian philosophy, you have African philosophy, you'll have Jewish philosophy, but there's such a thing called philosophy. It's not called sort of Christian philosophy or the heritage of Greek philosophy. So it always comes with presumed authority as the decider of how other things approximate to it. And I think that is embedded in its system of thought as it's practiced in originally Europe and then in the Anglosphere. And this was like sort of very strongly held views, specifically about Jewish thought, that the constant conflict between Judaism and Christianity. So if we go into sort of the way Kant would think about Jewish thought and Jewish practice as being not universal enough for him, so therefore it lacks its validity. Hegel would critique Jewish thought and the Jewish way of thinking. This supersessionism, in a way, of overcoming the Jewish mode of thinking and the Jewish mode of being, placed sort of a particular opposition, I think, to Jewish thought. Now, sometimes within the practice of Jewish studies, there's it can be its own worst enemy. So the attempt by many people who engaged in the sort of the philosophical study of Judaism, they were navigating their own emancipation, their own assimilation into this Western Christian culture. And for them, it was necessary to also do away and to overcome some of the more what they considered embarrassing elements of Judaism, which they associated with Eastern European Jews, Eastern European rabbis as well. So whereas maybe they had some interesting intellectual things to say, it couldn't be tolerated if it was being espoused by somebody who didn't go to the university, didn't write in a philosophical idiom, but wrote in a rabbinic idiom, someone who didn't dress in modern Western styles. So, I came up with this sort of this. I think we discussed it at one point back. Like, how do you define who is a traditional rabbi? And so we picked up on these three things: university education, dress, and in what sort of style they wrote. Were they writing for an in-audience in a rabbinic style, or were they writing in even if they were writing in Hebrew, was it in a more sort of contemporary philosophical style? And so you usually need to have all three to get some type of attention, and even then, not always. But for Schneersohn, who, as we said, he was born and lived most of his life in a small village in Russia, in the town of Lubavitch, did not go to university, and wrote in a particular rabbinic style, made him an irrelevancy.
So you're saying these elements of those marks he has, these are just the outward features of his sort of traditional lifestyle and dress, and not having a university diploma to show, and being from Eastern Europe. You could say those.
And there was one other thing. I mean, the Kabbalistic aspect as well.
Okay, yeah.
So the sense in which, especially amongst the Wissenschaft scholars, there was a huge opposition to Kabbalistic thought, and they saw this as the enemy of rationalistic thinking. And so the style in which they wrote about Kabbalistic thinkers was very derogatory. And even when you have this revival of sort of an appreciation of Kabbalistic thought through Gershom Shalom and sort of the Department of Jewish Mysticism in the Hebrew University and all of the students that came out of that, there's still a sense of this esoteric otherness to the Kabbalistically orientated thinkers, such that why would you then include them in Shalom's agenda was to quite clearly distinguish the Kabbalistic thinkers from the philosophical thinkers. So it just further embedded and entrenched the situatedness of Schneersohn outside of any meaningful philosophical discussion.
Right. So with you're saying these types of prejudices, which then continue, if someone was interested in philosophy and they know about people like Levinas, Derrida, Kristeva, those are philosophers, but someone who's interested in them wouldn't think, if I want to learn about someone who did similar types of philosophical thinking, maybe I'll look at someone like Schneersohn. That something about that wouldn't occur.
There'd be 10 hurdles before you got there. Yeah,
right.
It's so beyond thinking.
And so is this something that still isn't addressed today, right? Because, for instance, that people have now discussed the ways in which, say, there had been previous prejudices against certain types of people from different demographic groups, racial prejudices, gender prejudices, in terms of viewing such people as not relevant to philosophy. But it sounds like, in some ways, you're saying that with regard to this question of whether there could be substantive philosophical thought in these figures like Schneersohn, that prejudice still remains. And has it even been raised prior? Is your book sort of the first one to really foreground that?
It's the last frontier.
Because people can't even overcome a prejudice if it's not even discussed as a prejudice. That I feel like if a lot of people, the notion of, is there a prejudice against sort of writers coming from a traditionalist rabbinic context, prejudice in relation to not thinking of them as linked to philosophy? I just feel a lot of people would respond, well, what do they have to do with philosophy? I mean, that it would, that would they wouldn't even realize that they would be enacting the prejudice without even being aware of that. And so is there a challenge there to figure out how to name something as a prejudice if people aren't?
Very much so. And this is where sort of I would put a heavy critique on Jewish philosophy. That sort of, you would think that, you can't really blame philosophy for not paying attention to Schneersohn, if in Jewish philosophy he is not even being paid attention to. So your Cambridge companion to modern Jewish philosophy would not include Schneersohn, and it actually would not include any traditional. Or it might include a traditional rabbi that went to university, wrote in a modern philosophical idiom, and dressed in contemporary dress, someone like Rabbi Soloveitchik. He might get included. And even then, that's sort of just about. So the idea that they would include Schneersohn, it would take so many steps, an undoing of what I think as a discipline, they consider to be important boundaries. So I think these are sort of structural boundaries in place within the discipline of Jewish thought that sees the engagement in philosophy as a move outside of a traditional setting.
Right.
And so therefore it's a category error to think about this in that way.
Right. I thought it was interesting because you mentioned the author Saba Mahmoud, and sort of her work on the way in which she challenges. She writes about various aspects in which, say, in traditionalist, more traditional or traditionalist Islamic societies, there's an assumption of women not having agency, and whether that, and she analyzes whether that is a false prejudice and may come from imposing both certain assumptions and certain conceptual framings on the society that's being studied. And so I thought it was interesting that we've talked about rabbinic, but maybe part of it could be notions of prejudices about what could be going on in traditional or traditionalist frameworks that could then be being applied to traditionalist Jewish frameworks or traditionalist Islamic frameworks. But that there would be an assumption that certain things wouldn't be going on, agency or philosophy. Is that so? You see, is the notion traditionalist then key in this prejudice?
Yeah, I think it works probably across most traditional groups. I think you will find maybe more interest in traditional Islamic philosophy than you might do in traditional Jewish philosophy in sort of an academic setting. Just for cultural reasons, I think there is when you're talking about, say, comparative philosophy, there is something Orientalist about the exoticism of something Islamic or something that is Asian or African. Whereas because this is European, and the Jewish European other he's got this rather awkward positioning in relation to the Christian sort of hegemony. And so to sort of let that genie out of the box, so to speak, to allow the European Jew to have its place. Like if you go back to things like, say, Mendelssohn, the difficulties that Mendelssohn had, and Mendelssohn was, the good Jew.
He was right. I guess he didn't go to university, but he did write. And I guess at the mode he wrote in was Andress, yeah, more
traditional, more in the modern style.
Yeah.
And so I think there are a lot of forces at work, I think, that subconsciously would suppress, and I think you actually find this a lot with Russian thinkers, the Easternness of it, the sort of the control of the European narrative, that we don't see the inclusion of Russian thinkers into the canon and treated with sort of the seriousness that you have from Central and Western European thinkers. And I think that's similarly because of its sort of very alternative tradition and distinctiveness vis-a-vis sort of what you might call Western modernity, makes people find it extremely difficult to engage in a substantive way.
Right. So it's both that the way he dresses, not going to university, and then being from the East, from Russia, is all could be contributing in different ways, and right in various different things. Right. If there's a writer who's from Russia, but maybe is writing from a Christian context, and maybe in the mode of writing is more typical of Western social discourse. The anti-Eastern, anti-Russian prejudice could affect it somewhat, but we're saying with someone like Schneersohn, there's a whole bunch of things.
He ticks all the wrong boxes.
Yeah, that's interesting. And do you want to say a little bit more, if we bring in some of these questions then about the way in which you said some of his thinking about challenging some of the traditional conceptual hierarchies prefigures thinkers like Levinas, Derrida, Kristeva. Do you want to say obviously to go into all the details of the philosophical argument, you have to read the book, but what do you think is going on in terms of that? It seems notable that someone would be writing not only in this more traditionalist context, but also say 60 years before these other writers, and seeming to do things which challenge things which only were really challenged in the Western mainstream philosophical context after the 1950s.
Mhm.
So how could we account for the fact that Schneersohn might be doing some of these things that look similar to that already in the 19th century? Whereas those challenges weren't going on in the mainstream Western philosophy in the 19th century.
So I would say two things. I think bringing up Mahmoud again,
Yeah.
she brings out how it's possible that within traditional societies, it's possible to think the unthinkable in a way that isn't as readily available to people who exist within a sort of more or within societies that are part of the established social order. Sort of there's a sense of security and control over the ideas that aren't going to spill over into sort of broader social context. So if you think about the other thinkers I've engaged with, so Levinas less so, but definitely Derrida and Kristeva, they were very much part of the riotous social order in Paris in '68, and their ideas were not just sort of things were being said at a seminar, people not paying any attention, but they were part and parcel of the sort of the transforming society they were in. So it puts an onus on the thinker about what they say and how they say it. Whereas for Schneersohn, I think it was able to be preserved as a sort of a much more conceptually, and wouldn't have the sort of the social impact. I think a lot of the ideas that he comes up with become much more prominent, especially within a Chabad setting, post-war, in a similar period to the other thinkers, so in the 1950s and 1960s, with the emergence of greater significance of female participation in Chabad settings, greater significance of the bodily performance of the commandments, that all became central to the Chabad ideology post-war.
Right.
So I think the safety and security of being in a little village in the middle of Russia allows you to sort of think a bit more freely, and that might be a reason why it came earlier. But a very helpful way that I had to think about a lot of this was, and to sort of overcome this, what we're talking. I mean, we've talked so far all about this sort of how do we configure these two these two components of thinking, two components of philosophical thought together. And for me, the key to it all was in the writings of Shmuel Eisenstadt. So Eisenstadt is German and Israeli sociologist who was at the forefront of developing this theory of modernization, which was labeled multiple modernities. And to pick on one sort of aspect of the way he thought about it, he argued that modernization is not Westernization, that there isn't this, we don't have to follow this notion in sociology, which was made prominent through thinkers like Weber, that modernity is about the transition from a traditional society into a secular society. So once you sort of buy into this sort of narrative, then obviously a traditional thinker has got nothing to contribute to a modern secular process. They're stuck 3 steps behind in maybe Weber's process. However, Eisenstadt shows how, like, even within, say, Western modernity, we do not see a consistency of everyone accepting an identical form of rejection of tradition and acceptance of what you might call a secularism. He brings examples from, the clear difference between the United Kingdom and France. The retaining of the monarchy is a very different concept of modernity than what we saw in France. And so he sort of pushes us to think about modernity as something, maybe something more metaphysical, and less a sort of a social economic process. And he talks about the difference between a transcendence and an immanence. So concepts of transcendence and immanence. And he tries to identify how modernities happen when when there is a reconsideration of this relationship, of how transcendence and immanence function together, how they operate. So historically, they could be seen as a binary, a very distinct oppositional binary. Some places that a solution to that might be a rejection of transcendence and engaging in pure immanence, so a materialism, maybe, or actually rejecting an immanence and going to a sort of a metaphysical, abstract metaphysical reality and transcendence. But then the real act of modernity is coming up with a new solution or a new harmonization of that transcendence and immanence. And I think something that Schneersohn is clearly doing is thinking about those types of terms. So the mashpia is always, the provider is always seen as the sort of the transcendent in the role, in the relationship, vis-a-vis so the soul and the body, the male and the female, these are how they're historically configured. And so what we get out of it is a sort of a complete reconsideration of how immanence functions vis-a-vis the transcendent. And that's what makes it modern. That's what makes it, notwithstanding, or I don't even have to have that caveat, but what some people might say, notwithstanding its traditional context. But I would say, regardless of its traditional context, because in trying to appreciate what is this modern turn, and what I've hoped to show in the book is that this parallel between Schneersohn and the avant-garde of the 60s and 70s in Paris forces us to think about modernity in a very different way, and to overcome these historical biases that we discussed earlier.
Right, no, it's interesting, right, because the example you gave about the United Kingdom and France with regard to the monarchy. So someone could think, the transition from monarchy to democracy is part of modernity. And so if in the United Kingdom, they haven't gone beyond monarchy, they probably couldn't engage in any modern thought in the United Kingdom. We can see that. And now people don't seem to have that prejudice to that degree, but right to say, but somehow that there's an assumption that if someone like Schneersohn is operating in a certain traditional cultural context, he wouldn't be able to engage in any of these challenging of these hierarchy of body and soul or men and women in that way. And and what you're saying is if there can be modern thinking in the United Kingdom, then maybe there could also be modern thinking in someone like Schneersohn. And I guess with any case, it's not automatic, right? It's not that someone in a traditional context would automatically be engaging in modern thinking, but we have to actually look and see, not assume beforehand that it couldn't be there. So that's yeah. Do you think it's should we open to questions or thought from the audience? Yeah.
Thank you, Reuven. It's super interesting. There's so many things one could comment about, but I'll try and be very brief. So I'm gonna just guess. I mean, the audience that he's addressing in these sermons in 1898, presumably he's addressing a local audience and I'm guessing he's written them himself. And are these the ones that are subsequently edited by Menachem Mendel Schneersohn? Do I remember rightly that he was interested in editing and publishing these?
Published, but not edited. I wouldn't say edited.
Well, in
published.
the sense of collecting them and publishing them.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm just thinking, in terms of whether he's been slighted by his work not having been read, I'm guessing that it wasn't really available to a wide audience, nor was he aiming. That was not his intention. So I mean, from the standpoint of he's been slighted historically, but if it wasn't published until after the war in the United States, then it simply isn't available to anyone.
Right. So it's been 50 years since it was published. And I don't think the lack of availability is the primary problem. I think and what I would take from what you're saying is, what might be interesting is, I don't think he cared to be read by Levinas, Derrida, and Kristeva. I don't think that was his agenda. But at the same time, I'm not sure why that matters so much for us thinking about it. I don't think we should be held hostage to that sort of like cultural dynamic of why he wasn't sort of publishing and trying to reach this sort of broader audience. He was speaking locally. He wrote them himself. They were copied and spread and distributed widely amongst sort of adherents. There was awareness of him in wider Jewish circles. So, he was visited, and he was a relative. I mean, he was a relative to Ahad Ha'am, for example, Ahad Ha'am's wife, rather, but through marriage. And Chagall came to visit him. I mean, it's not like he was an unknown within the Jewish world. He was one of the most prominent Jewish leaders in Eastern Europe till 1920, till he passed away, and was involved in sort of rabbinic assemblies and conventions to discuss various issues. He was very prominent when it came to the Baylis affair, blood libel in 1913. He wasn't an anonymous character in that way. So I think that people who were interested in him could have gained access to his ideas. But I think that there is a truth to the fact that, and in its style, I think in the style that it's written, it's writing to a certain audience. But I think it's the work of scholars to, and I think we see this in many other thinkers, who they try very hard to read across traditions and intellectual conventions, and learn foreign languages and do all types of things. But here it seems to be a certain reticence to do so.
I mean, I guess it's a good point. You have to, in any case, you have to measure against. Okay, if it's only published in 1976, it couldn't be read before then. If it's published in Hebrew, it needs to be people who can read Hebrew. So there would be certain, but you said you could still say proportionally to all those factors, there still seems to be a non-engagement or an assumption that there wouldn't be philosophical substance in this type of writing. There might be mystical substance, Kabbalistic, but philosophy wouldn't be. People wouldn't go to this type of.
I'll give you an example. Why I don't think it's so relevant, because let's say, for example, the writings of his son, who took over the leadership after him in 1920 and passed away in New York in 1950. So his writings, especially the writings from and his sermons from 1940 to 1950, were published and were made widely available.
Once he's in the States.
Okay, once in the States, and we're talking about in the night, none of them have been examined or treated in any serious way by scholars. Levinas printed his first book, I think, in 1947. But there is a whole industry of Levinas studies. But in Schneersohn study, there isn't. And it wasn't because it wasn't available. So I think that's only a circumstantial, and it doesn't really get to the nub of the issue.
Okay. So thinking of I'm wondering what the occasion was in 1898 that he offered these particular sermons, and could you contextualize the sort of the thinking he's doing that's new, place it in the context of 1898? Why is this happening in 1898, and on what occasion?
So fundamentally, I don't know. What I think is that there was a significant development in 1897. So in 1897, he established a yeshiva. So in Chabad, there was never a yeshiva, a rabbinical seminary where people used to come to Lubavitch and study, but there was at different times there was an infrastructure, but it wasn't seen as a central activity. Many Chabad adherents would study in the other yeshivot that were in Volozhin and all the other places that were famous in those days. In 1897, he establishes the yeshiva, and this becomes his central project. And in a way, he sort of focuses on the youth. He takes on a completely different approach. He doesn't ignore the older generation, but he now has a nucleus of people that he's educating, he's teaching. And the teaching changes significantly. It's much more structured, it's much more consistent. And you can see he's educating a young generation in profound Hasidic thought. And he sees this as a necessary development because he is very concerned about the forces at play in Russian society, both from Zionism and the Haskalah. And he sees that the youth are being completely drawn away from traditional Judaism. So he gives them a very emphatic sort of amount of intellectual rigor. And I think this is just holds a whole load of them. And he sees them as being the necessary means by which to combat all of these oppositional forces. So many of these people end up becoming the emissaries for the movement. And once communism takes over, these are the people who run the Chabad underground, ensure the provision of Jewish education in Russia, all the way until the fall of the Soviet Union. And it was the ethos and the ideas and the injection of energy that came in those years that gave the power to the movement to achieve that it could survive Stalin, it could survive all of those years of communist oppression. And what that then translated into is when ultimately, after the war, Chabad was able to escape Europe, it was able to utilize these same ideas to have this very forceful outreach direction.
I was going to say, no, this is really interesting because in some ways, by describing that setting, it was a setting of potential. Schneersohn had these feelings of rupture or seeking to address social changes that were going on. So it's interesting to think, whether that context would have prompted a need to think of something new, if maybe the previous hierarchies were shown to be not totally working. And so maybe he's not consciously thinking this way, but he's like, okay, something hasn't been working. We need to develop post-structuralist thought and challenge these types of intellectual hierarchies to have something that can work differently. It'd be interesting. I don't know. Again, it's in that.
It's hard to know.
Again, maybe not consciously, but that setting that you asked about, it raises those questions in interesting ways.
Thank you. I can't wait to read. So I have a question about these binaries that you're talking about. Of course, I'm asking about these, but it seems to me that this mashpia mekabel shift that you say, does it turn into a rhizome? Like, is it connecting to these ideas of non-hierarchical, which then means rhizomic? And today, then we talk about Deleuze, of course, and even there's this new movement talking about lichens and that other kind of symbiotic, non-nucleus based beingness.
So I wouldn't go that far, because I think what he wants to establish is he definitely doesn't want to invert the hierarchy such that the receiver becomes the dominant, just acquires all of the qualities of the provider. So I think then you maintain the primacy of reason. So speech is just as good, if not, it does reason better than reason. But you've still preserved the supremacy of reason. Or women can be just as expressive and defining as men. That would be, or they can be just as present as men. And that would just be inverting these hierarchies. And I think what he wants to do is to, first of all, reconsider the profundity of the act of receiving, or sometimes what you might call, using the language of Levinas, is absence. That instead of that being an inferiority and a problem, it's actually something we experience as a profundity. So the way he thinks of it is that we often think that if someone has something to give, then they have everything, and the receiver has nothing, so they're empty. But he wants to think that when somebody doesn't have something, there is a sense of stability. They are what they are. They're not anything that they have. They just are themselves. And that sort of more essential core being is something to be alert to. And then conversely, the provider is the one who's unstable. They're constantly in a sense of having to give. They're compelled to give. They're not able to just be still, just to be present. And that sort of, and then he sees, and that's why he thinks that speech can do what it does. That's why he thinks that women can have babies, that women can be creative, speech can be creative, the body can be transformative. All of these abilities reflect a stability, and that stability, or that essential identity, is much more aligned and akin with divine stability and essence. So God is not compelled to give anything. God just is. So all things that just are and are passive and what we might call absent from the act of projection, they're somehow mimicking or the divine stability. And they're not just mimicking it, they are it. They are the instantiation of divine stability in the world. And that is why everyone wants to give them everything. That is why men want to have babies with them. That's why we think ideas. We think ideas in order to be able to experience them in speech, in the act of othering it to something else.
Can I just ask you a follow up on that? But then that means that the binary remains.
Yes.
The binary is not broken, so it's not a taking away of the binary.
Correct, but it becomes not oppositional anymore. It's more about the breaking of an oppositional binary. And ultimately, it wants to show that once we've sort of figured out, or this already is a radical move, I think, that he says that, what's most important is maternity, not paternity. The only reason why there is paternity is because of maternity. The only reason why we think ideas in the very first place is because we have the capacity to communicate with another person. So speech is the trigger, is the catalyst, is the cause. Women are the cause of male paternity. But then he moves to the next phase where he says, but without consciousness, without men, without the soul, none of this would be realized.
So without both of them, I mean,
you need the provider to provide the awareness of the profundity of the recipient.
It's interesting. I don't know if you discuss it in the book, but in terms of that type of description of gender dynamics, so it's challenging a certain notion of oppositional binary in which the male is treated just as superior and the purpose, the main, and the woman is seen as not relevant or as in a lower position. Would there be streams of feminist thought that you've looked at that would be more akin to Schneersohn, right? Because there could be definitely some streams of thought that would say that would emphasize place less emphasis on the difference between men and women. And you're saying Schneersohn doesn't. He seems to retain the difference, but give a different valuation to that difference. So but I feel there would then be streams of feminist thought that would be potentially similar to him.
Yes.
In some of these ways, and I don't know. Again, what would?
So I think obviously I pick up on Christeva
Right.
A lot. I think, and her experience of motherhood
Mhm.
is a very significant part. The way she thinks about the role of women, and she differs quite a bit from her other second-wave feminists in that regard. So, there's Schneersohn definitely buys into a gender essentialism and a distinction between the genders. And he, first of all, his two moves are, he undoes the hierarchical element of the gender difference to start with, which could, and in the early stages of the writings, position the feminine superior to the masculine. But I think he comes at the end to reckon, like his resolution at the end is more of as what I think you said, you said symbiosis of roles. That it's not, you can't achieve the objectives of the feminine without the masculine. And so as such, they need each other, they're dependent on each other. But I do think still at the end, the goal is the female creative power of creating children, which the man does not have. So whereas in earlier thoughts, they somehow relegated the mother as being just a sort of an incubator, a means by which the man can have a child. And so the child belongs to the father. You have going all the way back to sort of Roman law, like the father has this right, the father right to be able to decide whether the child lives or not. The association is always with the father to the child, not the mother. And that is embedded in lots of streams of Western thought and in Jewish thought and even in Chabad thought. And so by coming along in here and really just saying that, in fact, the mother creates the child. It's all to do with her.
So if you're saying it this way, if previous streams in dominant sort of Western philosophy, going back to Greco-Roman context, and I guess in some forms of Jewish thought, but not all, you have the notion that the mother is there simply to provide the means by which the father can then generate offspring. In this one is saying that the father is there as the means by which the mother can. It's sort of that the mother is the creative agent there, and the father is needed in order to enable the primary creative agent to do the creating. Now, did you find, were there any thinkers, either in Jewish or general philosophy, prior to Schneersohn, who placed that emphasis on switching that?
I've yet to find.
So it's
because I haven't seen it doesn't exist.
Right, but it's interesting just in terms of the.
I mean, you do have the kernel of these ideas in earlier Chabad thought, but very underdeveloped.
So, but say outside of Chabad, then it's I mean, no, right? Maybe it's all, but I mean, it's a really interesting question. Of like, I mean, could one say that this? I mean, that it would be an interesting historical claim to ask, where or in which times and places was that type of challenge, and were there instances prior to the 19th century?
Well, I think it's in the scientific debate of I forget the terminology.
Oh, this is the one seed and two seed.
Yeah,
like who's the
ovarists and I can't remember their corollary.
Right.
I don't know.
But right, there's some people thought that only the father provides the seed.
Right.
And then the mother is just the material.
But that goes back to Galen and
right,
stuff.
Right.
That's earlier, but even in the 17th century, but I don't think they medically, scientifically affirmed the existence of the ovum till early 20th century. I don't think it was I mean, I think the predominant, I think probably people's, the dominant thinking in enlightened scientific circles was that the woman created the child. The fetus was predominantly from the mother, but it still was an open discussion. It wasn't as if there wasn't scientific opinions saying the opposite.
And right, so there's the scientific discourse, and then to what degree does that come into philosophical reflection or not? Yeah,
but that's in the intellectual history of it. I don't know.
Yeah,
it's hard to know where. I mean, he had only one child. So I don't know, and I'm not sure in Eastern Europe what the awareness and understanding of these things, how strong it was. It's hard.
Did he have did he have the child with his wife before he wrote this?
Yes.
Then? So that's interesting. So he had experienced his wife's pregnancy and that element, and so that was before he wrote. So that's an interesting. Just sort of direct experience might have shaped his
may have.
interest.
Thanks, Reuven, for some very interesting ideas as always. I guess one could think about, the last several decades in Western society or the Anglosphere as sort of trying to grapple with these oppositional binaries and sort of muddling through. And I guess this sort of Western canon that you described earlier, which clearly is very hierarchical and places themselves at the top, and sort of, in that sense, sort of defines themselves as sort of the epitome of modernity, and as sort of traditional thought as sort of anti-modernity, if you will. And as you described, sort of Schneersohn pushes back whether, maybe he didn't intend to be read in dialogue with that, but in any event, pushing back against that conception of traditionalism as anti-modernity. And I guess maybe I'm committing a sin in trying to instantiate the oppositional binary, but if modernity is trying to sort of grapple with immanence and transcendence and thinking about sort of a symbiosis or a synthesis of post-traditional and traditional thought, what would the anti-modernity then be? Or have I totally missed the point of the talk? And then the second part of that is, I imagine for someone who's in a traditionalist framework or environment, engaging with post-traditionalist or non-traditionalist ideas could present some challenges and vice versa. So I guess I wonder if, to what degree was Schneerson's ideas welcomed or not in this sort of traditional rabbinic or Kabbalistic environment, and might that present some sort of a path forward in trying to find the sort of true modernity that society's been sort of trying to achieve?
So I'll take the second part first. I think the experience of the readers or the listeners, because this text, the 1898 lectures, are still the primary text, first in the curriculum in the yeshiva that he established. So 120 years later, every 17-year-old boy is going to be nearly every 17-year-old boy in the system will study these texts.
What about the girls?
The girls, it depends. They're my daughters, they will, but I'm not sure it's as widespread. Certain girls' systems, I've given classes in girls' seminaries on it. So it does exist, but it's not as insisted upon. So I think this is very much insisted upon as a studied text. Now, like everything that you study when you're 17, I think everyone here is older than 17, so I'm not going to be condescending. There's ways that you assimilate those ideas. You don't necessarily have the maturity, the experience of life to understand all of the implications of the ideas. However, I think it does embed a orientation within the readers that is indeed sort of controversial in the wider Jewish world. That's why the graduates of these Chabad yeshiva systems have no problem standing on a street corner putting on tefillin with someone, and they don't feel intimidated or uncomfortable. Whereas somebody coming out of a different educational system would not only find that uncomfortable, they might find it ridiculous. And they might argue philosophically that what is the point of somebody performing a material act and ritual, such as putting on tefillin or any other mitzvah, when they're not going to engage with it intellectually, emotionally, and take on a full commitment to Jewish lifestyle. Now, that comes from an ideology that places belief, faith, which I call in the book a sort of a very Christianized notion of Judaism, where it's all determined by what you feel and what you know, rather than what you do. And so even somebody who might give a little bit of leeway and say, okay, it's good as a means to an end. It might be okay to do that on a street corner if that person then enrolls in a Jewish educational institution and then becomes fully committed to Jewish life. But as an act in and of itself, it has no value in certain Jewish educational systems. So the people who listen to this idea would be, and absorb the ideas, would be convinced of the profundity of a mere act. And in a way, the act in isolation from everything else takes on a new profundity, because once a person performs acts as a result of an intellectual conviction, then it maintains this hierarchical binary, whereby the motivation for the act comes from the intellectual impetus for it. Whereas the isolated act is a pure act that recognizes the profundity of the body and the profundity of active ritual. Now, obviously, as the conclusion of the essays is, that can then, in order to appreciate that profundity, the person has to also study, have an idea of why that's profound. But if your starting point is something's profound and then do it, or if we go back, nishma v'naseh, I'm going to understand and then I'm going to do, then the act you're going to ultimately do is going to be limited to the quality of your comprehension of it. But if the act is a result of a deep appreciation of the body and the material, then the possibilities of thought become much more profound, much more illuminated, and much more articulate than would otherwise be possible. So I think that the recipients of the ideas would maybe not come out as, intense second-wave feminists like Kristeva, or that might not be the result of their educational experience, but I think they will have the paradigmatic possibilities of all of these post-structuralist possibilities that wouldn't be shocking or uncomfortable, or I'd like to think at least.
So right, I guess you could do a test. If people come out of that framework, and you test people who came out of that framework, and if they read Kristeva, you're saying they would find it less surprising than people who didn't come out of that framework and then read Kristeva.
I think they're more, they're more conditioned to appreciate how those ideas manifest in other thought systems. The first half I didn't really understand. Sorry. The first point I didn't quite get.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you. Really, really interesting. If I may go all the way back to the first ideas that you expressed about the relationship between thought and words. So in many ways, this is preceded by 100 and odd years the development of modern education theory, where teaching, God forbid, is only complete when it's actually learned. So the importance of the student as a receiver, as a recipient of whatever words of wisdom, even lecturers in Cambridge have to impart, and the importance of language in forming that connection and also in distilling the thought that is being taught. So I'm curious whether Schneersohn's thought was actually shaped by some kind of a dialogue. Did he have any partners to discuss this? Are we missing out on other thinkers that maybe lived in the same sphere? What brought him to express such radical ideas for his time within a relatively conservative environment? Was it just spurious genius, or was there a process or an event that led to it?
So he had some friends, even after he assumed the leadership or was thrust into sort of a leadership position at a very young age, at 21. His father died young, so he was very young when it started. And so he still had childhood friends who stayed sort of friendly, but obviously his position meant that was not so possible. But I don't think that would have exposed him to a lot. This Russian village of Lubavitch was not as sort of backwards as maybe some people think. It wasn't just Chabad Hasidim living there. There were other groups, and so there would have been a diversity of the local area. People came to. He traveled a lot. He went, to the main cities of Leningrad, or then it was St. Petersburg. He traveled around Europe. He went to Vienna. He met Freud. He went to Berlin. He enjoyed the aquarium in Berlin. He writes in one of his letters about his experience. He went to the Louvre. He spent many summers in the south of France in Menton, recuperating from various ailments. So he had exposure to a wider world. The extent to which he indulged in that is very hard to decipher. We have snippets of information, but I always like the description that Achad Ha'am, sort of the early, how do you describe Achad Ha'am? The early Hebrew scholar, Hebrew revivalist, he came to visit him to discuss a particular issue. And when he came out, the Hasidim wanted to know, this big sort of heretic coming to speak to the rabbi, like what was the discussion? What he said. So he came out and he reinvented a sort of a familiar rabbinic phrase that talks about what makes someone a heretic. You're a heretic if you're deyat ribono u'mechaven nimrod bo. You can only really be a heretic if you know about God and then you decide actively to rebel against it. So that's how if someone doesn't have any knowledge of God, then their heresy is not meaningful because they lack the capacity to reject what they don't understand. So he came out and he said about Schneersohn that Yodeat ha'olam u'mechaven nimrod bo. He knows all about the world, and he decides to rebel against it. So his impression was that he was extremely worldly, very understanding and familiar, but we don't have much more to work on from his writings, other than sort of what I've and this and in many other things, where you see just sort of such a creative mind. One of the things worth mentioning is that amongst the Hasidim, he was labeled as the Maimonides of Hasidut. He got this sort of title, and one of the reasons being is just like Maimonides codified Jewish law, so someone needs to study the whole Talmud to get some idea of what Jewish thought is, and then it's all jumbled and it's not in a convenient order. Came along Maimonides and he made an order, and the clarity of thought of such a vast amount of material into a coherent whole. And similarly, in the writings of Schneersohn, he takes the earlier works of Hasidic thought, which are very hard to maybe put into a coherent beginning, middle, and end, and he does the work of piecing things together and creating a very coherent corpus of knowledge. And I think his orderliness then makes him sort of the go-to person, especially within people who study Chabad, to his writings, in a way that he becomes indispensable. You can't just, a lot of the academic research on Chabad looks at the early generations and they ignore him. And even the early generations are impossible to grasp without him. He's sort of such the central figure. I don't know how I got into that, but
I wonder if actually just following up the part of what you also raised about the educational theory. And I wonder if you were trying to come up with a context where Schneersohn might have developed some of his ideas. It's interesting if you think of certain forms of educational transmission, say in European universities at the time, where the lecture was the primary thing, and that seems there's the hierarchy there. There's the person speaking who generates the ideas, and they're inseminated in the minds of the listeners, and there's sort of that impregnation of thought. Some of these metaphors seem like they apply, and that it's sort of that hierarchical element might map onto some of these other hierarchies, and whether in the say the social setting that of the yeshiva context, if learning is something that's done where both the teacher and student are playing a role, and it's doesn't have the same type of hierarchy, could that educational setting have possibly generated some of his ideas about on this, something that's quite unique to the Chabad setting, is that when he would deliver the sermon, he would first of all, he practiced what he preached. So he would write the sermon beforehand, usually, and then he would deliver it. The method of delivery was quite peculiar in that his son, his only son, would stand opposite him. So he'd be on a dais, and he'd be just like he would be talking to his son, and everyone else would be listening in. That was the format. Yeah, he knew there would be one person who could understand what he was talking about. But then there was a team of people who would review what was said. It was all oral. No transcript was given out. He didn't give out the transcript. That was for his own use. And they would review and review and review over sort of a 12-hour period. So he'd deliver the talk on a Friday night, and then on the next morning, this group of people who were chosen for their ability to grasp things quickly, to have good memory, they would come into his room and stand. He'd sit by his desk. He'd be there with a cup of tea, and they would start repeating it to him. They'd repeat back to him what he said, and he would correct them in places, like say, no, this is what I meant, and they would have a chance to ask questions, and there'd be this dual process. And then what he would do is he would then write notes on his draft based on having spoken it and developed his ideas and having had that feedback. He would then write his notes, and then he'd give the manuscript to the scribe, who would have to incorporate all of his edits into the main text, and then it would get copied and sent around. So there was this
it was teaching, and there was the sermon element where it was just what you described like the lecture where you just sort of project, but there was this feedback loop that then refined the ideas.
Thank you. Maybe just to follow up on that, and I think, first of all, thank you very much for the lecture, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. When I try to give a certain reason of why, for example, a certain school, a certain idea would not be part of, the greater narrative in the history of philosophy, there are different conditions that I'm looking for, and one of them is methodology. It's the methods that the person used and how relevant those methods, epistemic methods in particular, are to the wider community. How can we communicate or somehow be relevant to them? Maimonides, for example, had Maimonides emerged in the late 19th century, in 1899, I suspect that he wouldn't have received any recognition very similar to what you discussed here, because the epistemic program and the methodology that he offered could not create conversations maybe with the philosophical program around. And I'm very interested. I know very little about the way Chabad works. Is it more hermeneutical? He somehow combines mysticism, if I understand, with commentarial or hermeneutical method. And I assume there is some also different epistemic kind of stances. Maybe his own experiences play a role there. So am I right in reading?
So I think that's fair. I think I'd add that I think Maimonides, were he not to have been so heavily quoted by Aquinas and appreciated in that sense, would also probably not have achieved the fame that he did. So it was even then, I'm not sure how accessible he was ordinarily. And I think these are just like sort of obvious historical circumstances that he would be ignored. I don't think I'm not surprised that in 1910 there was not someone writing about, oh wow, look at the new thing, about something that was said like that. I'm talking about now. We talk so much about refreshing the curriculum, thinking outside. Sometimes it just seems quite performative when there can be a white European man who is being ignored just because he maybe isn't as exciting as the possibility of feminist philosophy or African philosophy or something like that. And so I'm just sort of saying, let's pay attention to him first of all. And once you have an example where you can see fruitful results, so I can understand why lots of people, you say it's like a unconscious bias, because if they don't even know that it's going to be relevant. But hopefully with the book, like that's the ambition, that people will say, actually, I recognize that there was a 19th century rabbinic thinker who anticipated many ideas in post-structuralist thought and can help us understand it better and overcome certain blind spots that we have when we study post-structuralist thought. Then maybe there's more material out there. So in our attempt to have a more fruitful, rich, and meaningful philosophical discussion, we now, hopefully the book will stimulate the desire to look further afield.
If I can just follow on that, I very much share this opinion, but would you not then be worried of some sort of teleological reading of this philosophy? If the merit of this philosophy is by predicting, by being post-structuralist before, I'm sure he has more to give.
No, I recognize that it comes across as somewhat like an apologetic. And I do write in the book that the goal is not just to approximate him with the primary audience that I'm addressing have to be given their dues. And I think at the end of the exercise, he can then be appreciated on his own terms, and seen within his own context. And that might be interesting And there's so much other material which he's writing about, and he's not the only one. I mean, if we're going to do the who's who of the sort of the ignored modern rabbinic thinkers that could become serious interlocutors with contemporary thought and philosophy, he's just one of them. He's not the only one. And until more and more people are engaging with it, then we can't have the fruitful. I mean, I have my way of thinking about it, which is obviously going to be limited and contained to my abilities. The more people that are involved in this discussion will produce a much more thoughtful, interesting outcome, I'd like to think.
I think that could be a good maybe way to conclude, because it's sort of very forward thinking. Now you've sort of shown with this one thinker that there is philosophically relevant thought in places where people have ignored it or haven't thought it would be there. And so after sort of people hopefully can engage with this book and see that there, maybe they can engage Schneerson's thought, but then from there you're saying actually there may be a wide range of other people who are writing in traditional rabbinic contexts or other types of traditional contexts even that may also have very relevant things that can be more widely relevant. So hopefully we'll see that. We'll have to wait and see what comes of your book.
Next.
Right. But thank you again for sharing your book with us. And yeah, we're looking forward to reading it or rereading it as the case may be.
Thank you.
So.